from the time I was 15 and started my first band with my buddies, we were like, we're gonna be rock stars. So it's what you always
when you're 15.
what you always plan.
Yeah.
And it seems like a pretty realistic goal when you're a teenager.
Yes.
And
but
then
you're a ruler of the universe at that point.
Sure, of course, you
Yes.
can do anything.
Yes.
I thought I'd be an oceanographer and an astronaut and an architect as well, and then those would be very easy things to do. But being a musician is probably even harder than that.
Yeah.
So essentially, what happens is, that first band doesn't make it, and the friends who can't hack the disappointment sort of drift away, and I stuck with music and being a singer-songwriter, and a lot of the reason that I sort of stuck with it is because places like this, literally, like the Calgary Folk Festival was the first place that booked me in like '97 for as a sort of an act that made me feel legitimate and validified, and so I kept going with that. But it was weird because I was always attracted to songs with story and character and a lot of dense lyrics and sometimes provocative subject matter, and I found it difficult to penetrate the commercial world of music,
Mm-hmm.
clubs and the music circuit that sort of relies upon selling beer and selling an experience that is easy to identify and easy to pigeonhole. I was never able to do that, so I slogged it out for a lot of years and had a lot of great experiences and played a lot of wonderful festivals and did tours and did things, but it got to a point where it was almost like a breaking point where the idea of sleeping on someone's couch in Regina in the middle of February while their dog is walking around on a wooden floor in the middle of the night was not. I was like, oh God. So it was funny. I've sort of hit this point where it's like, I don't think, as much as I love it, it's not a viable career. And almost at that same time, I remember getting a call from Sage Theatre in town, who wanted me to be involved in a musical theatre production called Canadian Graffiti, and then that started to snowball, and I started getting more theater work, and then doing music in theater, then starting to act in theater, and then the acting in the theater led to film work. Yeah, it has been a cocktail of a lot of different worlds. But honestly, like, in order to not have to do drywall, like, you kind of need to diversify a little bit.
Yes.
Yes.
So, what was the highlight of your Poet Laureate time?
There was, there was a kind of going a couple different realms. There's like memorable because it's strange and weird, and memorable because it's really meaningful. And I think from a meaningful standpoint, one of my favorite parts was mentoring a young 14-year-old girl with her poetry for a couple of months, and then seeing her presented at her school, because her poetry was really good, and I didn't have to do a whole lot other than sort of usher her a little bit into finding her own voice and confidence as a performer of her own pieces. Working with her was a highlight, and then from a sort of more just bizarre standpoint was probably performing a piece at the flood benefit at McMahon Stadium, where I had to go up on stage at McMahon Stadium and do a piece right after Randy Bachman did Taking Care of Business, and then I did my piece about Deerfoot Trail. It's called Deerfoot. And then right after, I walked off the stage, and there was someone there that shook my hand, said, "Good job, bud," and it was Chad Kroeger from Nickelback. And I was like, oh crap. Right. So that was just kind of, it was one of those extreme celebrity experience, because that doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, a real
But
mixture.
occasionally you'd get drawn into that world a little bit.
Yeah.
And it was kind of neat too, sort of getting a little bit of an inside view of City Hall and stuff like that, and getting to know all the councillors and the mayor and how things work in that world. It was really cool.
Yeah.
I probably wrote, 50 or 60 new pieces over 2 years, because I was getting asked to do stuff like 2-3 times a week.
What did you do with them? Where are they? Have they been?
I'm compiling them, and they should be, and I'm almost done the book, and so hopefully it'll come out in the spring, next spring.
Okay.
Yeah. Sadly, in a city with almost 1 million people, where everyone's very busy and stressed and worried about things, there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of loneliness and a lot of sense that you're alone in your struggle, or that you don't want to bother somebody else with articulating your struggle. And what art does, and I think what poetry does in a beautiful way, is you can't have poetry without like assessment and reflection. Calgary is a very present day and forward thinking place, you know, in a very commerce oriented world. We tend to not want to reflect on our personal histories and our cultural histories, our actual histories. We don't want to do it because it's uncomfortable and it's difficult. And we ask ourselves, what's the point of doing that? And ultimately, I think poetry's had that function always, is that it gives that sense of collectivity that isn't organized by, a society or by money or by place. It's just a beautiful, intangible way of feeling connected to the people in your community. And I think hearing, it's wonderful to read poetry off the page in privacy in your bed or on a bus, but poetry has always been part of an oral tradition. Whether it's First Nations or Greeks, or the English Romantics would always have their little parlor sessions where they would invite everybody over and they would read their poetry. It was meant to be a shared thing, and what's funny is that I think it was even more so. Poetry was even more in the public realm in Calgary over 100 years ago. And when I was Poet Laureate, I had a buddy in town named Harry Sanders, who's a historian.
Yeah.
You've probably met Harry, and he would always send me clippings from newspapers that he would articles that he would have found from years ago, and commonly in the Herald and the Albertan, there was poetry written by members of the public or well-known poets. You'd see it sometimes 3-4 times in one newspaper. Poetry was in the public realm almost more. And granted, it's obvious why. We have some jazzier forms of entertainment now that are a little bit easier. But in some ways, it's what I think is neat about poetry is it's almost like sometimes it's a matter of recapturing something that has always been there that we've kind of lost a little bit more of. But it hits spots in a person's brain and body that they don't understand. And that's what's nice is, sometimes when I was reading pieces for firemen or bankers or people who didn't have poetry in their public realm, they would come up and afterwards and say, it was really cool to hear that. I had no idea what you were saying, but it didn't seem to matter.
No.
They enjoyed hearing the language, and they enjoyed connecting, and they enjoyed seeing someone who was passionate about something that technically doesn't mean anything or doesn't matter or isn't, you know what I mean? Because that, one of the big arguments about art is that, is it necessary? And well, technically not. Really, like, as animals, we just need to eat and sleep and shit, and then we're fine. Like, art is, but it is so amazingly important.
Yeah.
But a lot of people don't. They need to discover that. They need to discover it in a very personal way. So I think poetry has a directness. It has that weird subtlety and intangible quality that affects people without them knowing why they're being affected by it. And that's what's beautiful about it.